9-year-old girl looked at a stack of cash like it was something dangerous and asked for a bowl of rice instead. 15 years later, she'd look at a guilty verdict the same way and ask for the truth instead. Some debts don't get settled with money or with blood. They get settled quietly, with patience, with silence, with a single brown folder marked evidence carried through courtroom doors that were never supposed to open for her. Welcome back to the channel. Before we step into the cold beneath that bridge, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. If you believe real justice can't be bought with blood money, hit like and subscribe to join the story. 2:30 in the morning, and the cold under the bridge had teeth. Jin Woo stood with his hands loose at his sides, breath fogging in short bursts, watching the man in front of him try to decide whether he was still going to die tonight. The supplier, a mid-level distributor named Hak-soo who'd made the mistake of skimming shipment weights for 8 months running, had stopped talking. That was usually the moment it ended. Jin Woo didn't need words anymore. He needed the silence that came after someone finally understood the arithmetic of their own mistake. It ended the way it always did. Quiet. Efficient. 2 men peeled Hak-soo off into a car that would take him somewhere for a longer, more private conversation about restitution, and Jin Woo straightened his coat and turned to walk the 4 blocks back to where his driver was waiting. That was when he heard her. Not crying, not really. It was smaller than that, more controlled, a kind of muffled, furious breathing, like someone was trying very hard not to make a sound and failing by degrees. He almost walked past it. God knows he'd walked past worse things under worse bridges. But something in the rhythm of it caught on him, the way a splinter catches on skin, and he stopped. She was maybe 15 feet back from the road, tucked into the dead space where the concrete pillar met the embankment, and she had her own coat, thin, ragged, entirely inadequate, stretched over a smaller shape curled against her. A boy. 6, maybe 7. His breathing had a wet, rattling quality that Jin Woo recognized instantly and did not like at all. The girl saw him before he'd fully registered her. She didn't flinch. She didn't scramble back. She just went very still, the way an animal goes still when it's calculating distance and exits, and stared at him with an expression that had no business existing on a face that young, flat, assessing, entirely unafraid. "He's sick," Jin Woo said, not a question. "He's fine," she said, which was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie, and neither of them acknowledged that fact. Jin Woo reached into his coat. He had a habit, an old one, a cheap one if he was honest with himself, of paying his way out of moments like this. A wad of bills folded in his pocket for exactly this purpose. Guilt money, conscience money, the toll he paid so he could keep walking without the weight of what he'd just seen following him home. He held it out to her. She looked at the money, the way she might look at something dead on the sidewalk. "I don't want that." "It's not a trick, take it. Get him somewhere warm." "You think I don't know what that is?" Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, the only sign of her age breaking through. "Rich men give money so they can stop looking at you, so they can go home and not think about it. I don't want your not thinking about it money." Jin Woo, who had built an empire on the precise calculation of what people wanted and what they'd do to get it, found himself with nothing to calculate. This had never happened to him before, or if it had been so long ago he no longer remembered the shape of it. "Then what do you want?" "Food, real food. Not money that turns into food after you've already left and stopped caring whether it did." He almost laughed. He didn't, because something about her face told him that laughing would be the last mistake he made tonight, in a night that had already contained several mistakes he intended to correct. He crouched down instead, bringing himself level with her, an act that cost him something he couldn't name, a small surrender of the height he used, deliberately, to make grown men flinch. "What's your name?" "Tony." "That's not a girl's name." "It's mine." He was still working out what to say to that when the footsteps came, 3 sets, moving with the loose, unhurried confidence of men who thought they'd found something soft in the dark. Local scavengers, the kind that circled bridges like this, looking for exactly what Tony and her brother represented. Something unguarded, something that couldn't fight back. Jin Woo didn't think. His body simply reacted, 15 years of instinct arriving before conscious thought, a forearm redirecting a swung fist, a knee finding the exact soft place beneath a ribcage, a man folding to the pavement gasping before he'd even understood he'd been hit. It took 11 seconds. It was not elegant. It was not meant to be elegant. It was a demonstration, brutal and total, and by the time the third man had scrambled back into the dark, cursing, Jinwoo was breathing hard and Tony hadn't moved an inch. She hadn't hidden. She hadn't screamed. She'd watched the entire thing with the same flat, assessing stare she'd given the money, and when he turned back to her, chest still heaving, she said the only thing she'd said all night that actually landed. "You're not a good person." Jinwoo opened his mouth to argue and found, to his own genuine surprise, that he couldn't. "No," he said quietly, "I'm not." She nodded once, like a fact had been confirmed and filed away for later use, and that was when her brother's breathing changed. A long, dragging rattle followed by a silence that lasted 1 second too long, and then another, and Tony's flat composure cracked wide open into something raw and terrified as she screamed his name into the freezing dark. And Jinwoo realized, with a cold drop in his stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature, that whatever happened in the next 60 seconds was going to matter far more than anything that had happened under this bridge tonight. The hospital smelled like bleach and something underneath the bleach that no amount of cleaning could quite erase. Jinwoo had paid for the best room on the pediatric floor, the fastest doctors, machines flown in from a private supplier who didn't ask questions about who was footing the bill. None of it mattered. The pneumonia had already dug in too deep, too long, by the time anyone with real medicine had gotten near the boy, and 3 days after that night under the bridge, a doctor with tired eyes and a practiced, gentle voice told Tony that her brother wasn't going to wake up again. She didn't scream. That was the part that stayed with Jinwoo longest, not the tears which came later alone in the stairwell where she thought no one could hear her, but the terrible stillness that came first. The same flat, assessing look she'd given him under the bridge, turned now on a hospital bed, on a small chest that had stopped rising. Like she was filing this away too. Like she'd already known, somewhere under the anger, that this was how it was always going to end, and the only surprise was that it had taken this long. Jinwoo found her 20 minutes later on the concrete stairwell landing between the 4th and 5th floors, sitting with her knees pulled to her chest, not crying anymore, just staring at the wall like it owed her an explanation. He sat down beside her, not too close. He had learned that much about her already. "I'm not going to tell you it gets better," he said. "I don't know if that's true. I've never had anyone worth losing enough to find out." She didn't look at him. "I have a house," he continued. "Too big, too empty. I have more money than I know what to do with and no one to leave it to, and I am, by every measure that matters. Not a good person, you told me that yourself, and you weren't wrong. But I can feed you. I can put you somewhere warm and keep the men who did this." He gestured vaguely at the hospital walls, at the poverty that had let a treatable illness turn fatal, away from you for the rest of your life. "That's not charity. I don't have charity in me. It's a mistake. I'm choosing to make it on purpose." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, in a voice scraped raw from 3 days of crying she hadn't let anyone see, "Why?" "Because you're the first person in 15 years who told me the truth to my face and didn't flinch afterward. I don't know what to do with that except keep it close." She looked at him then, really looked, the way she had under the bridge, weighing him like a debt she wasn't sure she wanted to collect. And then she nodded, once, the same small, final nod she'd given him after watching him break a man's ribs in the dark, and that was the whole negotiation. No paperwork changed hands for another 6 weeks. It didn't need to. The terms had already been set on a concrete stairwell that smelled like bleach and grief. The mansion, when she finally arrived at it, looked exactly like she expected it would, which was to say, it looked like a mausoleum with better lighting. Marble floors that swallowed sound. A staircase wide enough to land a helicopter on. Portraits of men Jinwoo never talked about, hung in a hallway no one used. Tony walked through the front doors in the same thin coat from the bridge, carrying nothing, and felt 60 pairs of unseen eyes measuring exactly how long she'd last. Only one person actually greeted her. He came down the hallway with the kind of warmth that seemed to arrive a half-second too well-timed, hand extended, smile arranged like it had been rehearsed in a mirror that morning. Soft-spoken, perfectly pressed suit, the kind of man who made himself small in a room full of dangerous men and was, for exactly that reason, never suspected of being the most dangerous one in it. "You must be Tony," he said, crouching slightly to meet her eye level, the way adults do with children they've decided to underestimate. "Mr. Jin Woo has told me so much. I'll make sure this house treats you well." She shook his hand because refusing would have been its own kind of statement, and something about the careful gentleness of his grip made the hair on her arms rise in a way the marble and the portraits and the cavernous silence hadn't managed to do. She couldn't have named it at 9 years old. She wouldn't have the vocabulary for another decade, words like calculating, like contingency, like asset, but some old animal part of her filed the handshake away exactly the way she'd filed away the money in the snow, exactly the way she'd filed away Jinwoo's violence under the bridge, as information, as a debt that would need collecting someday, whether she understood the currency yet or not. The lieutenant smiled warmly as Tony walked through the doors, pretending to welcome her while secretly calculating how to use her arrival to his advantage. If you can't stand two-faced snakes who pretend to be your friend while plotting your downfall, hit subscribe right now and comment. I reject the parasites, to show you stand for absolute transparency. Behind them, unnoticed by either the girl or the man now leading her toward a bedroom 3 times the size of anything she'd ever slept in, Jinwoo watched the lieutenant's hand linger a half-second too long on her shoulder. A small, proprietary gesture, gone almost before it registered, and felt, for reasons he couldn't name and wouldn't examine for another 15 years, the first cold thread of unease he had ever associated with the one man in his empire he trusted completely. 2 years into her life in that marble house, Tony had stopped flinching at the size of it. She'd learned the names of the portraits nobody talked about, learned which hallways echoed and which absorbed sound, learned that the household staff addressed her with a careful, unplaceable formality, not quite respect, not quite fear, but the specific caution people reserve for something they haven't yet decided how to categorize. She was 11 years old, and she had already decided that everyone in this house was lying to her about something, and she had decided, with the same flat patience she'd once aimed at a stack of cash in the snow, that she was going to find out what. Dinner in the mansion was a formal, uncomfortable ritual, a table long enough to seat 16, set for 2, with Jinwoo at the head and Tony at his right hand, because he had never once suggested she sit anywhere else. That night, over rice and grilled fish neither of them had touched, Tony set down her chopsticks with the deliberate finality of someone closing a book. Halcyon Freight Logistics moved $412,000 through 6 shipping invoices last month, she said. The invoices are for cargo weights that don't match the trucking manifests. I checked. The trucks that supposedly carried that weight of goods couldn't have. I looked up their axle ratings. So either your shipping company is lying about what it moves, or it isn't really moving anything at all. Jinwoo did not choke on his food, which he considered, afterward, a genuine achievement of self-control. "Where did you see the invoices?" he said carefully. "In your study. You left the ledger open. I wasn't looking for it. I was looking for a book." A pause, precise as a scalpel. "But once I saw it, I looked at it." "That's not something an 11-year-old should be looking at." "That's not an answer." She held his gaze the way she had under the bridge, the way she always did, utterly without the deference a child was supposed to have for the man who fed her. "You're washing money through a company that doesn't really ship anything. That's what a front company is. I read about it. It's called money laundering, and if the invoices don't match real cargo, whoever built that ledger did it badly, because I found it in an afternoon." Jinwoo set down his own chopsticks and studied the girl across from him. The girl who now wore her hair in 2 long, careful braids the housekeeper had taught her to do herself, who had absorbed 2 years of tutors and books, and the strange, sharp-edged education of growing up in a house full of things no one would explain to her, and had apparently turned all of it into a scalpel aimed directly at the center of everything he'd built. "You're not wrong," he admitted. There was no version of lying to her that would survive more than a sentence, and he'd stopped trying weeks ago. But that ledger is not something you repeat, not to the staff, not to anyone. Why not if it's true? Because truth doesn't keep people safe. Silence does. Tony looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression, young enough to still be uncertain of itself, old enough to already have opinions sharp as broken glass, told him this was not a battle he had won so much as postponed. He tried, in the weeks that followed, to do the only thing he knew how to do with a problem, bury it under resources. If Tony's mind was going to keep finding cracks in his empire's foundation, he decided, then the answer was to give that mind somewhere else to point itself. Somewhere impressive, somewhere flattering, somewhere that would keep her occupied, and if he was honest with himself, somewhere that would make him feel less like a criminal being quietly deposed by an 11-year-old. He hired professors. Real ones, expensive ones, poached quietly from 3 different universities with salaries that made department heads look the other way. A mathematician who'd published in journals Jin Woo couldn't pronounce, a legal scholar who'd clerked for a constitutional court, an economist who specialized in exactly the kind of financial architecture Jin Woo desperately needed her not to understand any better than she already did. His plan, insofar as he allowed himself to examine it, was simple: exhaust her. Challenge her so thoroughly with legitimate, dazzling knowledge that she'd have no bandwidth left to keep dismantling his ledgers over rice. It worked for about 6 weeks, in the sense that Tony devoured every lesson those professors brought her with a hunger that unsettled even them. And it failed completely, in the sense that every new thing she learned became another tool she turned, with quiet, devastating precision, directly back on him. The economist made the mistake in month 2 of using a real-world case study to illustrate structured transactions, a hypothetical shipping company, invoices that didn't match manifests, cash that entered clean and exited cleaner. He had chosen the example, he later swore, entirely at random. Tony sat through the entire lesson without a single comment. Then, as the professor packed up his materials, she asked, in the same flat, unhurried voice she'd used on the money in the snow, "Is that a real example, or is that what my father's company does?" The professor laughed it off. Jin Woo, watching from the doorway where he'd come to check on the lesson's progress, did not laugh at all, because in that instant he understood, with the cold clarity of a man realizing a fire has already reached the load-bearing wall, that he had not given his daughter a distraction. He had given her a curriculum. And somewhere in the mansion's east wing, in an office he trusted completely, his lieutenant was still smiling that same rehearsed, half-second too-warm smile, still filing away, in his own quiet ledger, exactly how much this brilliant, unflinching girl was starting to see. By 14, Tony had stopped waiting to be invited into the rooms where decisions were made. She simply appeared in them, notebook under her arm, and dared anyone to tell her to leave. The lawyers hated it. There were 4 of them that year, retained at obscene hourly rates to restructure Jin Woo's holdings into something that could survive an audit, a raid, or a rival syndicate's lawyers, whichever came first. They met in the study twice a month, spread documents across the same desk where Tony had once found an open ledger by accident, and for a long time Jin Woo had let her sit in the corner with her books, assuming she was there to be near him rather than to listen. He'd stopped assuming that months ago. "This structure has a hole in it," she said, halfway through a presentation on a new holding arrangement designed to shield the syndicate's core assets behind 3 layers of shell entities. She was 14, and she said it the way she said everything, without heat, without apology, like she was reporting weather. "You've got Halcyon Freight as the parent entity for the logistics arm, and Halcyon owns the shipping licenses. But the licenses are non-transferable under maritime code if the parent company's ownership changes by more than 40% in a single filing year. If anyone ever needs to move ownership fast, say, because a court freezes assets, this whole structure locks up for 18 months while you fight a maritime tribunal. You built a vault with the door welded shut from the inside." The senior lawyer, a man who had drafted this exact language for 3 other clients without a single objection, opened his mouth, closed it, and reached for the maritime code binder with the particular slowness of a man checking a fact he was fairly sure he already knew and desperately hoped he was wrong about. He was not wrong about it. He was, in fact, exactly as wrong as Tony had said. Jinwoo watched this happen with something that had stopped being pride weeks ago and had curdled slowly into a low and persistent unease, because it wasn't the correction itself that unsettled him. It was how easily it came to her. How she found the flaw the way other people found typos, without visible effort, and how the lawyers had started, without anyone instructing them to, glancing at her before finalizing anything, waiting for the 14-year-old in the corner to nod. That night, after the lawyers had gone, she found him in his study, the same room, the same desk, a habit that had become almost ceremonial between them, and she didn't sit down. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it instead of deciding how to be annoyed about it first. That's a generous amount of warning for whatever's coming. Sunwoo has never once disagreed with you." She said it plainly, the way she'd said everything since she was 9 years old refusing money in the snow. "Not once in 5 years have I heard him say your instinct was wrong. Not about the Busan expansion, which lost money for 14 months. Not about the tariff structure that got 2 of your drivers detained. He agrees with everything every time immediately, and you've decided that means he's loyal. I don't think it does. I think it means he's patient." Jinwoo felt something tighten behind his sternum. Not anger, not yet, but the particular defensiveness of a man being told the one thing he'd built his entire operating philosophy around might be rotten at the root. Sunwoo had been at his side for over a decade. Sunwoo had absorbed blame that wasn't his, had smoothed over disputes with rival houses, had never once, not once, made Jinwoo feel like his authority was in question. In an empire built on fear, a man who never pushed back wasn't a threat. He was the entire point. "Loyalty is compliance," Jinwoo said. "That's how this world works. A man who agrees with me can't be plotting against me. He has no grievance to plot from." That's exactly backwards. Tony's voice had an edge now, the first real crack of frustration he'd heard from her in months. "A man who disagrees with you and stays anyway, that's loyalty, because he's choosing you over his own judgment out loud, where you can see it and weigh it. A man who never disagrees with you is either an idiot, which Sunwoo obviously isn't, or he's decided disagreeing costs him more than it's worth, which means he's playing a longer game than you are. You've built your entire empire on rewarding silence. You have no idea what any of these men actually think, because you've made it too dangerous for them to tell you." Jinwoo dismissed her warnings, choosing the comfortable lies of an empire built on absolute submission over the hard truths of his daughter. If you believe that true strength means having the courage to speak truth to power instead of blindly follow a broken system, hit like and drop a comment saying, "Truth over comfort." "You're 14, Jinwoo said, and regretted it the moment it left his mouth, because it wasn't an argument, it was a door closing, and he watched her face register exactly that. "Sunwoo has earned 15 years of trust. I won't undo that because you found one gap in a maritime filing." Tony looked at him for a long moment, not hurt, exactly, something colder and more final than hurt, and nodded once, the same small, terminal nod she'd given him under the bridge the night her brother died, the nod that meant a fact had been filed away and would not be raised again by choice. "Fine," she said quietly, turning toward the door. "But when you're standing somewhere with no way out, remember I told you the vault was welded shut from the inside, and ask yourself who's been standing closest to the welding torch the whole time." The morning Tony left for the airport, Jinwoo stood at the top of the marble staircase and did not walk her down. It wasn't coldness. He told himself that for years afterward, and mostly believed it. It was that he didn't trust his own face to hold still if he got close enough to hers, and a man who had spent 30 years being unreadable did not intend to lose that particular skill in a foyer in front of the household staff. So he stood at the top of the stairs while she stood at the bottom with a single suitcase. She had never owned much, had never let herself accumulate the kind of things that made leaving hard, and they looked at each other across the distance the same way they'd looked at each other under the bridge 9 years earlier, weighing, assessing, refusing to be the first one to look away. "Columbia has a good law program," she said, like she was reporting weather again, though her voice had a thinness to it that gave her away. "I know. I looked into it before you applied." "Of course you did." Almost a smile. "Almost. I'm not doing this to get away from you." "I know that too." He did not know that entirely, and some small, dishonest part of him suspected she wasn't entirely sure either, that 18 years in a mansion full of men who lied for a living had left her hungry for a version of the truth that came with rules attached, with case law and precedent, and a system that couldn't be paid off in the same currency Jinwoo had built his life on. "Go learn the real thing. Then come back and tell me everything I'm still doing wrong." She left without another word, because they had never needed many between them, and Jinwoo stood at the top of that staircase for a long time after the car had pulled away, feeling, for the first time since a January night under a bridge, genuinely, completely alone in his own house. She called every week at first, then every 2 weeks. Then the calls thinned the way calls do when a person is building an entire second life on the other side of an ocean, filling every hour with a version of herself that had nothing to do with marble floors or portraits of men no one discussed, moot court, a research assistantship, a professor who told her, apparently without irony, that she had an unusually adversarial mind, which she'd relayed to Jinwoo over a crackling Trans-Pacific line with the closest thing to pure joy he'd ever heard in her voice. He was glad for her. He told himself that daily, and it was true, and it also left a hole in the house exactly her shape that nothing filled. He did not notice, in those first 2 years, what was happening in the rooms she'd left behind. It began small, the way rot always does, a signature on a routine wire authorization that Jinwoo didn't remember approving, chalked up to the volume of paperwork that came with running 6 front companies and 11 legitimate ones. Then a board resolution for Halcyon Freight's parent holding, restructuring precisely the ownership percentages Tony had once flagged as dangerous, filed under Jinwoo's name during a week he'd been in Busan handling a dispute with a rival house, and hadn't been anywhere near a signing pen. Sunwoo brought him the paperwork himself, each time, with the same soft, apologetic efficiency he'd offered for 15 years. "Just needs your initials here, sir. I've already had the language reviewed." And Jinwoo, busy, distracted, grieving an absence he refused to name as grief, initialed what was put in front of him, the way he had for a decade and a half, because a man who never disagreed with you had never once given him a reason to read the fine print. What Jinwoo did not know, could not have known, sitting in his study signing documents a devoted lieutenant assured him were routine, was that somewhere in a private office 3 doors down, a forger hired quietly, paid in cash, sworn to silence, had spent 11 months perfecting the specific pressure and slant of Jinwoo's signature, until it could no longer be told apart from the real one, not by a bank teller, not by a notary, not even, eventually, by Jinwoo himself. Every signature Sunwoo needed that Jinwoo hadn't actually given, the forger simply supplied, clean, confident, indistinguishable, and slid quietly into a filing cabinet of shell corporations, accumulating slowly, deliberately, 6,000 miles from the one person who would have recognized the shape of the trap the instant she saw it. By the time Tony finished her 2nd year of law school, immersed in casebooks about exactly this kind of fraud without ever once suspecting it was happening to her own father in real time, Sunwoo had already moved $11 million through accounts that existed only on paper, under a signature that was, and wasn't Jinwoo's, building a case file against his own employer with the patient, methodical care of a man who had spent 15 years being told that silence was the same thing as loyalty, and was now, finally, done being silent about what he actually wanted. The calls stopped entirely in Tony's 4th year away. There was no fight behind it, no single conversation that ended things, just a slow attrition of weeks into months into a year, the ordinary erosion of a life being built somewhere else, and Jinwoo told himself it was healthy, that a daughter shouldn't spend her 20s tethered to an old man's empire, that this was exactly the outcome he'd wanted the day he told her to go learn the real thing. He believed it most days. On the days he didn't, he sat alone in the study with her old chair still pushed against the same corner of the desk, and he did not move it, and he did not examine too closely why. The house had gotten quieter in a way that had nothing to do with square footage. Marble floors that had once merely echoed now seemed to actively swallow him. And Jin Woo, a man who had once commanded entire rooms into silence with a look, found himself, for the first time in his life, genuinely and completely alone with no one whose judgment he trusted enough to ask why it felt that way. It was into that silence that the tabloids arrived first, months before the prosecutors did, the way scavengers always arrive before the real predators. A photograph of Jin Woo leaving a restaurant alone, gray threading through hair that had once been solid black, captioned with a cruelty dressed up as concern. Empire's last emperor dines alone. Sources say syndicate in decline. Then another, and another, a slow drip of speculation that fed on itself, each article citing the last as evidence of a pattern that hadn't existed until the articles invented it. A man once feared across 3 cities was being repainted, week by week, as something smaller and sadder, isolated, aging, ripe for exactly the kind of fall the tabloids seemed almost gleeful to predict. Jin Woo told himself it didn't matter. Reputation was wind. Only assets and loyalty were weather that actually changed anything. He had both, or believed he did, right up until the morning 3 investigators from the Financial Crimes Division arrived at the mansion's front gate with a folder of paperwork, so thick it required 2 men to carry. The case, when it finally surfaced in full, was extraordinary in its completeness. 11 shell corporations, each traceable through a chain of signatures. His signatures, indistinguishable from the real thing to every forensic document examiner the prosecution hired, authorizing transactions that funneled money through Halcyon Freight's phantom shipping manifests and out into accounts in 4 different countries. Board resolutions restructuring ownership in exactly the pattern that would, conveniently, insulate one specific set of holdings from every asset freeze the court was about to issue. It was not a case built from suspicion. It was a case built from documents so meticulously prepared, so patiently accumulated over years, that the lead prosecutor described it in a press conference as the cleanest financial fraud file this office has ever been handed. And Jin Woo, watching that clip alone in a study that no longer felt like his, understood with a sick, dawning clarity that cleanest was not a compliment. It was a description of craftsmanship. Someone had built this trap with the patience of a man who had all the time in the world, because he did 15 years of it, standing so close that Jin Woo had never once thought to look at his hands. Sun Woo, through all of it, was extraordinary. He appeared at every hearing pre-trial, dutiful and shattered, telling investigators through visible tears that he'd trusted his employer completely, that he'd simply signed what he was told to sign, that he had no idea, none, he swore it, that any of this had been happening under his own nose. He wept in front of cameras. He offered to cooperate fully with prosecutors, handing over ledgers and files with the appearance of a man desperate to make things right. Each document he discovered, landing with surgical precision exactly where the case needed it to land. The crooked system closed around Jin Woo, engineered entirely by the man he trusted most to leave him rotting in a cage. If you despise backstabbers who frame innocent people to clear their own tracks, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. Don't let the manipulators win. Jin Woo sat through his own indictment, hearing in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and new paper, watching a prosecutor lay out 15 years of his life as a folder of exhibits, and understood, too late, far too late, in the exact way his daughter had once warned him it would arrive, that the vault really had been welded shut from the inside all along. He looked for Sun Woo in the gallery behind him, some last instinct still hopping to find an ally, and found him sitting 3 rows back, dabbing carefully at dry eyes, watching the proceedings with the calm, patient satisfaction of a man observing the final stage of a plan 15 years in the making. And it was only then, staring at that composed, grieving face, that Jin Woo finally understood exactly whose hands had been on the torch the entire time, and realized he had no idea how he was possibly going to prove it to a courtroom that had already decided he was guilty. The verdict wasn't in yet, but the courtroom had already decided. Jin Woo could feel it in the way the gallery leaned forward every time the judge spoke, the way the reporters in the back rows had stopped taking notes and started simply watching, the way his own legal team, 4 attorneys who'd cost more in a month than most people earned in a decade, had begun speaking to him in the careful, softened tone people use for the terminally ill. His lead attorney had said the word sentencing twice that morning, not as a warning, but as a plan, which told Jinwoo everything he needed to know about how this was going to end. He stood at the defense table in handcuffs, a formality the prosecution had insisted on for a man they'd successfully painted as dangerous, and which the judge, unmoved by 15 years of careful, legitimate reputation building, had granted without hesitation. The metal had gone from cold to warm to simply present. A weight he'd stopped noticing, except in the moments the courtroom fell silent, and he could hear the small metallic sound of his own hands shifting. The evidence had been devastating in its completeness. Forensic document examiners had testified for 2 full days that the signatures were his, indistinguishable, consistent, bearing every idiosyncrasy of his actual hand. Bank officials from 4 countries had walked the jury through wire transfers with a patience that felt, to Jinwoo, like watching his own coffin being built board by board in front of him. And through all of it, Sunwoo had sat in the gallery, 3 rows back, dabbing at dry eyes with a composure the press had already started calling dignified. Jinwoo had stopped looking for exits somewhere around the 2nd day of testimony. He had built his entire life on the principle that every problem had a solution if you had enough money, enough leverage, enough people willing to disappear inconvenient things. And for the first time in 30 years, he had discovered a problem that simply didn't respond to any lever he knew how to pull. The forgeries were too clean. The documents were too complete. Whoever had built this trap had built it to be inescapable, and Jinwoo understood, with the particular clarity of a man finally accepting something he'd spent months refusing to believe, that he was going to die in a cell having lost everything, including. He thought this with a fresh, sharp grief that surprised him even now, the one person who might have looked at this evidence and found the crack no one else could see. Except she hadn't called in over a year. Except the last time they'd spoken, he'd told her Sunwoo had earned his trust, and she'd looked at him like a door closing. The judge's clerk was already reading a preliminary statement into the record, the kind of procedural language that preceded a verdict, and Jinwoo felt his lead attorney's hand settle briefly on his shoulder, not reassurance. He understood now, but something closer to condolence. Somewhere behind him, a woman in the gallery was already crying, quietly, for a man she'd probably never met but whose public unraveling had apparently moved her anyway. The flash of a camera caught the wet track down his own cheek before he could stop it, and he didn't bother wiping it away. What was the point, now, of dignity? That was the exact moment the courtroom's heavy double doors swung open with a force that cracked against the back wall, loud enough that the judge's clerk stopped mid-sentence, and 60 heads turned as one. Tony walked in like she had never once doubted she belonged there. She wore a navy suit cut with the precision of someone who understood exactly what a room like this required, her braids pulled back, her expression carrying none of the flat, guarded neutrality Jinwoo remembered from a girl under a bridge. This was something else entirely, a controlled, focused fury, the look of a woman who had spent 4 years learning the exact architecture of a system built to protect people like her father, and had come back to weaponize every piece of it. Under her arm, held against her side like something she'd carried across an ocean without once loosening her grip, was a thick manila folder with a single word printed across its front in block letters: evidence. The prosecution's lead attorney rose halfway out of his seat, already objecting to an appearance no one had cleared. The judge banged the gavel once, sharply, demanding order. Jinwoo's own legal team turned in their chairs, bewildered, uncertain whether the woman striding down the center aisle was a disruption to be removed or something else entirely. And Jinwoo, handcuffed, humiliated, tears still drying on his face, simply stared at her, unable to make his voice work, because the last time he'd seen that expression on her face, she'd told him the vault was welded shut from the inside and walked out the door. And now here she was walking back through a different door entirely, carrying something in her hands that suggested she hadn't stopped thinking about that vault for a single day of the 4 years she'd been gone. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting cleanly through the chaos of the gallery, steady in a way that made the entire room go still. "My name is Tony Kang. I'm entering this proceeding as co-counsel for the defense, and I have evidence this court needs to see before it reads another word of that verdict." The judge, after a long moment of visibly weighing procedure against the sheer strangeness of what had just walked into her courtroom, allowed it, a narrow, provisional admission, on the record, that this new counsel would be heard before any verdict was entered. It was all Tony needed. She set the folder on the defense table, but she didn't open it right away. Instead, she asked the court's technician, with the calm specificity of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times on the flight over, to connect her laptop to the courtroom's projection screen. "4 years ago," she said, addressing the judge but pitching her voice for the entire room, "I left this country to study exactly the kind of fraud architecture that's been used to convict my father. I want to walk this court through what I found when I started looking at it from the other direction, not who signed these documents, but who benefited from the accounts they created." The first image on the screen was a wire transfer log, the kind of dense financial document that meant nothing to most of the gallery and everything to the 4 forensic examiners who'd spent 2 days testifying against Jin Woo. Tony highlighted a routing chain, funds moving from one of the shell corporations at the center of the prosecution's case, through 2 intermediary accounts in different countries, into a numbered account that, until 18 months ago, had required a secondary verification signature to access. "Whoever built these fraudulent entities was careful," she said. "Careful enough to forge a signature so precisely that 4 experts couldn't distinguish it from the real thing. But forging a signature on paper is not the same as forging biometric verification on a private banking app, which several of these transfers required once balances exceeded a certain threshold. That verification isn't paper. It's a fingerprint and a face scan, logged with a timestamp, stored on a server that a U.S. subpoena can actually reach, even when the account itself sits offshore." She clicked to the next slide. A verification log, timestamped, indexed to 7 of the largest transfers in the case, and beside each timestamp a name. Not Jin Woo's. A quiet ripple moved through the gallery before the judge could even lift the gavel to restore order, because Jin Woo, still cuffed, still frozen, was staring at the screen with an expression that had shifted entirely, from grief to something colder and more focused. The look of a man watching, for the first time in 18 months, the actual shape of what had been done to him. "Sunwoo Park," Tony read aloud, letting the name sit in the silence that followed. "Verified biometrically on all 7 transfers, not my father. The man who has sat behind him at every hearing in this trial, weeping for a boss he claims he never suspected." The reaction from the gallery came fast enough that the judge finally did bring down the gavel, hard, calling for order. But by then every head in the room had already turned toward the 3rd row, where Sunwoo sat. For 15 years, Jinwoo had only ever seen one version of that face, soft, agreeable, arranged into whatever expression the room required. He watched it now do something he had genuinely never witnessed. Crack. The careful stillness dissolved in real time, the practiced grief curdling into something raw and unguarded, and for one unmasked second the man everyone had called dignified looked instead exactly like what he was, cornered and furious about it. "That's fabricated," Sunwoo said, too loud, rising halfway out of his seat before the bailiffs could react. This is a setup, this is." "The bank's compliance officer is prepared to testify to the authenticity of every log on that screen," Tony said, without raising her voice at all, which somehow landed harder than shouting would have. "I'd be happy to walk the court through the chain of custody if counsel would like to sit back down." He didn't sit down. He lunged instead, not toward Tony, but toward the folder still resting on the defense table, some desperate animal instinct to physically destroy the one piece of evidence he could still reach before it finished destroying him. And the courtroom dissolved into motion, bailiffs shouting, the gallery scrambling back, and Jinwoo, cuffed hands and all, was already moving before he'd consciously decided to. 30 years of instinct roaring up exactly the way it had under a bridge 19 years earlier, ready to put this man on the ground the same way he'd put 3 strangers on the ground the night he met his daughter. As the lieutenant lunged in a fit of cowardly rage, he realized he had been completely outsmarted by the very girl he dismissed. If you love seeing arrogant bullies get completely dismantled by pure intelligence, hit that like button right now and comment, "Justice served." Tony stepped directly between them. Not a flinch, not a hesitation. She put her body squarely in the path of a man twice her size and a father capable of violence she'd witnessed with her own eyes as a child, and said the only thing that could have stopped him, in a voice that cracked, just once, with everything 19 years had built between them. "Not like this. Not anymore. You promised me you'd let the law finish this." And Jin Woo, chained, furious, one motion from becoming exactly the man she'd once told him he wasn't, froze with his hands still raised, staring at his daughter's back as the bailiffs finally closed around Sunwoo, and understood that the hardest thing he would ever do in that courtroom was not clearing his name. It was standing still. The acquittal came 11 days later, delivered by a judge whose voice carried none of the theater of the trial itself. Just 4 flat sentences dismantling 18 months of manufactured guilt, followed by an order for Sunwoo Park's immediate arrest on charges of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Jinwoo heard the word acquitted and felt nothing at first, the particular numbness of a man who has spent so long preparing for a cage that freedom arrives like a language he's forgotten how to speak. It was Tony's hand on his shoulder, steady, familiar, the same quiet weight she'd once refused to let a rich man's guilt money replace. That told him it was real. The empire he walked back into, however, was not the one he'd left. He understood within the first week that acquittal and restoration were not the same thing. The 11 shell corporations were gone, seized or dissolved, and what remained of Halcyon Freight was a company built on forged paperwork and phantom cargo, structurally incapable of surviving honest scrutiny. He could have started over the old way, new fronts, new forgers, new lieutenants trained to smile and never disagree. The instinct was there, worn into him by 30 years of habit. It was Tony, sitting across from him at that same long dinner table, who laid out the alternative. "You have real trucks," she said. "Real drivers, real warehouses, real relationships with ports up and down the coast. You built an entire logistics operation to hide something illegal inside it. What if the thing inside it was just logistics?" It was not a fast process, and no one who lived through it ever called it easy. Untangling 15 years of laundered money from the legitimate operations layered around it took 2 full years of forensic accountants, licensing boards, and government inspectors who arrived expecting to find exactly the kind of empire the tabloids had spent a year describing. Jinwoo submitted to every audit. He fired men who had built careers on fear and replaced them with people who had never once needed to be afraid of him to do their jobs well. He converted warehouses that had quietly moved contraband into facilities that moved, verifiably, only what their manifests claimed, and watched, with a strange, unfamiliar satisfaction, as the company's actual revenue eventually surpassed what the laundering had ever generated, built on nothing more exotic than reliability. The money that came out the other side of that transformation, Tony insisted, didn't belong entirely to him anymore. A portion went into shelters across the city, the kind of place that might have saved her brother, had one existed under that particular bridge 19 years earlier. Another portion funded a legal aid clinic where she began, quietly, taking cases pro bono for people who'd never be able to afford the kind of defense that had once saved her father. Jinwoo signed every check without complaint, because he had learned, finally and completely, that the only kind of power worth protecting was the kind that didn't require anyone to be afraid of him to respect him. It was Tony who suggested, one January morning nearly a year after the acquittal, that they go back to the bridge. The city had changed around it, new construction, cleaner streets, the particular gentrified indifference that swallows old landmarks without ceremony. But the bridge itself was the same concrete pillar, the same biting cold that got into the bones no matter how good the coat. Jinwoo carried 2 boxes of hot food, real food, the kind a 9-year-old girl had once demanded instead of cash she recognized as a rich man's way of not thinking about her. There was no one sheltering there that particular morning, no immediate mouth to feed, and for a moment they simply stood together in the cold, looking at the empty space where a debt neither of them still owed had first been struck. "I used to think this was the worst night of my life," Tony said finally. "It was the worst night of mine too," Jin Woo said, "and the only good decision I ever made." She didn't argue with that, which from her was its own kind of agreement. They left the food anyway, set carefully against the pillar for whoever needed it next, a small ongoing ritual that had nothing to do with guilt and everything to do with a debt they'd both decided was worth paying forward indefinitely. A mafia boss who'd learned that real strength meant standing still, and the girl who'd taught him that together, walking away from the bridge that had built them both. Together, the mafia boss and the girl from the bridge proved that real power isn't built on how many people fear you, but how many people you lift up. If you stand for redemption and want to see more stories where light triumphs over the ultimate dark, click subscribe, hit the bell icon, and comment, "I stand for justice," down below.